Hello guys, FurballTheHammy, your friendly neighborhood hamster, is back again for another Hypixel Skyblock video. And a couple months ago I made this video regarding this topic, but it's rather outdated as times have changed and the community's expectations have grown over time. On a side note, this video is just a fun video and the general idea I've gotten from the community and the multiple guilds I've visited. It isn't the official definition of what is and what isn't the stage of the game, and at the end of the day, we are all once early game players, so don't worry too much, and without further ado, let's begin with the video. The metric used to measure the stage of the game players are in for today's video are going to be skill average, wealth or gear and weapons, slayers, dungeons, talisman collections, and minion slots. However, before we move on, be sure to smash the subscribe button down below because 60% of you guys are still unsubscribed and we are already halfway to YouTube rank. And let me tell you why you want to subscribe, because at 20,000 subscribers, I will be doing 1,500 tier 4 events, so feel free to subscribe if you want to see me die a horrible death. And with that, let's get on to the video. Firstly, let's talk about early game players. Early game players in today's standards include a skill average of around 15 and under. In terms of wealth and gear, early game players would generally be using Ender armor, old or protector dragon armor, although I do not know why people still buy old or protector dragon armor, even though being tanky outside of the end serves very little use for early game players. Early game players will also be using weapons like a silver Fang, and that includes the aspect of the end or around those range of weapons. And in terms of talismans, early game players will have around less than 50% of the total talismans on average. Early game players will also generally have less than 12 minion slots or around that amount. And yeah, that's basically for early game players. And secondly, let's now talk about mid game players. Mid game players by today's standards are expected to have a skill average of between 15 to 25. And in terms of wealth and gear, mid game players will be proceeding on to items such as young dragon armor or strong dragon armor with a raider's axe or a leaping sword. On a side note, if you have an aspect of the dragons and a weaker armor set like unstable dragon armor, it can still be considered as mid-game if you have the other requirements. In terms of talismans, mid-game players will have around 50 to 75% of all available talismans. Mid-game players will also be expected to have around 12 to 18 minion slots. And in terms of slayers, mid-game players will be expected to have started on some slayers and to be between 444 or 666 in slayers for talismans and useful items. Mid-game players, similarly to early game players, don't have requirements for dungeons due to the lack of gear and experience yet to properly grind dungeons efficiently. And now, we are moving on to late game players. This is the point where players have become proficient at the game and are ready to tackle the harder content such as tier 4 slayers and floor 2 and floor 3 dungeons. Late game players are expected to have a skill average of around 25 to 30, and in terms of wealth and gear, late game players are expected to have multiple sets of armor pieces other than the usual strong dragon armor and the aspect of the dragons, but also have one or two of the slayer sets and weapons such as tarantula armor or mastiff armor along with the pooch sword or the scorpion foil. Late game players are also expected to be fully making use of slayer items at this stage of the game and have attained items such as the mana flux power orb and the voodoo doll. On a side note, alternate armor sets such as adaptive armor and the legendary zombie soldier, skeleton master, or zombie knight armor sets are all included as alternate armor sets to replace tarantula and mastiff armor if you are a late game player trying to try out dungeons. And in terms of talismans, late game players will be expected to have around 75% to 90% of all talismans, and for minion slots, you will be expected to have around 19 to 21 minion slots. In terms of slayers, late game players will be expected to have achieved 777 or 300,000 slayer XP to fully make use of all items useful in slayers as well as their talismans. Late game players don't necessarily have to do dungeons, and I don't know the expectations for late game players in dungeons, but what I do know is that for late game players, you should be at least trying to be dealing with dungeons, and as a late game player, you should be expected to at least deal with floor 2 or floor 3 with a decent team. And last but not least, we have come to the end game players. Players at this stage have reached almost complete perfection and understanding of the game, However, because of this, the definition of endgame is quite hard to track down, as there are multiple avenues late game players may end up choosing to specialize in, such as the Slayer track, the Skill Average track, and the Dungeon tracks. Late game players may choose to specialize in one of the 3 tracks instead of being decent at all 3. After all, a jack of all trades is a master of none. And in general, the requirements I am going to list down below are just the expectations of an endgame player if they choose to specialize in all 3 tracks of the game. So if you do specialize in a specific track, such as the Skill Average track, and have a skill average of 45, but are lacking in the Slayer and Dungeon departments, you can still be considered as an endgame player. It is a very fluid definition, and because of that, it makes endgame players quite hard to define. Endgame players, however, are generally expected to have a skill average of 33 and above, and if you do specialize in skills, perhaps a skill average of 40 or higher. And for wealth and gear, endgame players are expected to have multiple armor sets, such as Superior Dragon Armor or Frozen Blaze, along with other armor sets such as the Legendary Skeleton Master, Zombie Soldier, Zombie Knight, or Adaptive Armor, along with a Hyper Cleaver, Spirit Scepter, Frozen Scythe, or other dungeon weapons. Endgame players are also expected to have chosen to settle with a Midas or an aspect of the dragons and an epic dragon pet at the very least, and are also expected to have a multitude of useful pets, such as the Wolf, Parrot, Wither Skeleton or Tiger or Dragon or the Blaze pet, and other skill grinding pets, for example the Silverfish pet. On a side note, endgame expectations for wealth are incredibly fluid and volatile. For example, if one has an Overflux Power Orb instead of a Midas, it can be substituted as an endgame item. Or perhaps one may choose to get a Spirit Scepter and an Ice Spray Wand instead of a Midas or a Dragon pet, which can also be substituted for these items. This makes endgame really hard to define in terms of wealth because of the freedom and multiple routes that you are offered, but a net worth of around 200 to 300 mil should be a safe expectation for endgame standards. And in terms of talismans, endgame players are expected to have 90 to 100% of all talismans, with the exclusion of specific talismans such as Melody's Hair, Treasure Artifact, and Seal of the Family being understandable. In terms of Slayers, endgame players will be expected to have a minimum of 877 because of Revenant level 8's useful perk. And for those who choose to go the Slayer route and are lacking in other areas such as skill average and dungeons, you would be expected to have a minimum of 1.5 million Slayer XP or around 889 if you do choose the Slayer path. And for dungeons, I'm basing it off the requirements of Aspect of the Bumble, which is a dungeon specialist guild today, with a minimum requirement of Catacombs level 21 to join, and because it was originally an endgame guild, I would consider Catacombs level 21 or above to be possibly what you want to get if you specialize in dungeons instead of Slayers or skills. At the end of the day, guys, I don't think it really matters at what stage you are at, because for endgame standards, at some point after grinding a huge amount to reach late game, we may end up choosing to just do what we enjoy rather than to pursue infinite amounts of wealth and riches. That's basically why I only do Slayers in some dungeons these days instead of grinding skills, even though I know my skills are not up to endgame standards yet, because I really enjoy doing dungeons and Slayers much more over skill grinding. Because for me, being an endgame player doesn't really matter, and what matters most importantly to me is that I enjoy playing the game. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are enjoying yourself and playing the game, no matter which stage of the game you are at, early, mid, late or end game, and if you do enjoy playing the game, I believe that you are doing great, no matter what stage of the game you are at. And with that, I hope you guys don't be too stressed out about what stage of the game you are at. This is merely just a fun video because some of you guys requested me to redo this video because it's been outdated. And yeah, with that, a Slayer boss a day keeps a /G kit command away, so be sure to do your daily Slayer bosses. And with that, this is FurballTheHammy, your Slayer maniac, signing out.